Hi, this is Matt Wimmer from Brody Precision. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at virtual machines. Virtual machines let you run Windows inside of Windows, and we're going to take a little bit of a look at why you would use them and how you set them up and run them on your Windows 10 computer. So why would you run a Windows virtual machine? Well, if you had old software that you wanted to run and you've been through the Windows 10 compatibility mode stuff and it still doesn't seem like it's working properly, a virtual machine will allow you to create an environment for that software to run in that replicates exactly what the software is expecting to run. So if you had a piece of software that wanted to run in Windows XP, you could spin up a virtual machine in Windows XP with just the right settings. And when you install that software in the Windows XP virtual machine, the software will have no idea it's running in anything other than Windows XP. So it'll just work. If you have a specific environment that you want to run software in or replicate, say you have a large site with a bunch of different versions of Niagara on it, and you wanted to test something out on your machine or on your bench yourself without touching the production environment, you could set up a virtual machine with a specific version of Niagara in it, have another version running in your local machine directly on the hardware, and you could have those two pieces of Niagara software talking to each other, because we know that we can't have multiple versions of Niagara running platform-wise at the same time, and this gives you the ability to do that. And then the last piece, and this video sort of serves as a stepping stone in that direction, is if you wanted to run software in the cloud, say you had a Niagara install or something that you wanted to run in the cloud yourself, or you wanted to do some sort of service for your customers, where you had a Niagara workbench or a Niagara server running in the cloud that kept all of their information centrally. You would run that in a virtual machine. When we go to Amazon Web Services and we say, hey, I'd like to purchase some space in your cloud, what we're really doing is saying, hey, I want a virtual machine in your data center, wherever we specify. So this video will serve as a stepping stone to that, and we'll have more videos on cloud installs and what that looks like specifically, because it is a little bit different than this, but the concepts are largely the same. So what is a virtual machine? A virtual machine is essentially just an emulation of a computer. So if we look at this diagram on the right here, we've got our physical hardware, that's our hardware that we can touch. We've got the operating system that's on that physical hardware. And then we have this hypervisor. What is a hypervisor? A hypervisor is essentially our emulation layer. It's a piece of software that you install and manage your virtual machines with, create virtual machines with, and it's what allows us to take our physical hardware and make it into virtual hardware that our virtual machines can then use to run things like Windows or really any other operating system that you want. And the popular versions of that software are VirtualBox, and that's what we're going to use in this video. That's made by Oracle. It's free. It's open source. You have Hyper-V, and that's the Microsoft virtualization software. It's free. It comes with Windows 10 Pro, but you have to turn it on as a feature. It doesn't get installed automatically when you install Windows 10 Pro on your computer. And then the last one is VMware Workstation. VMware is sort of the leader in virtual machines, virtual machine software, and Workstation is their Windows-based software that allows you to run a hypervisor on a Windows computer. They also have a bunch of other versions that run directly on servers and things like that, but for our use cases, Workstation is going to be the software that you're going to want. So a couple of other terms to keep in mind. We have a host. The host is going to be the physical computer. That's going to be your computer, the computer that you can touch. That's your host. And then your guest. The guest is just another name for a virtual machine. So in this diagram, our host is going to be all of these pieces here. And then our guest is going to be each of these individual virtual machines. So what does running the virtual machine look like? Well, first we're going to install our hypervisor. Like I said, we're going to use VirtualBox for that. Then we're going to create a Windows 10 ISO. And an ISO is essentially just a file that is a CD, essentially. So Windows allows you to create one of these files from a downloader on their website, and I'll update this slide so that includes a link to that ISO, and we'll download it, we'll create the ISO, and then what we'll do is when we create the virtual machine, we'll create a virtual CD-ROM drive, and we'll throw that ISO into the virtual CD-ROM drive, and I'll show you how to do that. And then from there, we'll use that CD to create our virtual machine. And then the last step is really important. It's not something that you really think about if you're not used to virtual machines, but in order to get the best performance out of a virtual machine, there are some very specific drivers and things that the hypervisor makers have created that allow you to get the speed and the fluidity of like the user interface and things like that in the virtual machine. So these guest additions from VirtualBox, they're super important, and it's just a matter of clicking a button in a drop-down in order to get them installed in our virtual machine. So let's hop into Windows now and go through this whole process. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is go to virtualbox.org, and we're going to download VirtualBox 6.1. And we know that we're using this on a Windows host because my machine is running Windows. So we'll select Windows hosts, download that installer, and then we'll come over to the Windows 10 installation maker tool, and we'll download that as well. And before we start up the VirtualBox install, I'm going to jump into the Windows 10 installation tool. I know it takes a little bit longer to download once we get it going here. And that also takes a little bit of time, so let's give it a few seconds. We'll agree to the EULA. Give it some more time. And we want to create installation media. We don't want to do anything to this machine, so we'll select Create Installation Media. We'll leave this at default because I want Windows 10, 64-bit, and in English. If you wanted something else, you could uncheck the box and select those drop-downs differently. And for the media we want to use, we want to create an ISO file. And this is what we'll load into our virtual machine to install Windows. So I'm going to select a location for it. I have this ISOs folder here. I'm just going to call this Windows 10. It'll get some things ready, and then it'll start downloading. You can see it's doing its thing there. All right, so while that's doing that, I can start up the VirtualBox installer. Next, we'll leave everything as default here. Next, leave everything as default. Next. And now we're going to potentially we'll lose some network connections temporarily while it installs some virtual network interfaces and things that it needs in order to get internet and networking to our virtual machines. So we'll say yes, and then we'll say install, and it will do its thing. All right, so it is installed now. I don't want to open it up right away, so we'll close out of this stuff, and we will wait for Windows 10 to finish downloading. All right, so our ISO is downloaded, and we are ready to go. ISOs are typically used to burn DVDs or CDs from. In our case, we're not going to do any of that. We don't need physical media because this is a virtual machine. We're just going to throw this ISO into the virtual machine when we first start it up. So we don't need to open the DVD burner or do anything like that. Just click finish and we're good to go. Microsoft cleans up a little bit, and now we're finished with that. So now we're going to open up VirtualBox. You should see a shortcut for it on your desktop. All right, with VirtualBox open now, you can see it's a pretty simplistic interface. Nothing too complicated at first glance. What basically will happen though is on the left we'll have a list of our virtual machines, and at the right, once we select one of those virtual machines, we'll have the ability to see specifications that we selected, a screenshot of what is going on the display of that virtual machine, and some details like that. But since we don't have anything, we're going to select new here at the very top. And we're going to give it a name. I'm just going to call this demo. And I'm going to move it. Actually, you know what? Let's keep it there. I'm going to call, let's call this VM demo. And now we're going to select the version of Windows that we're going to install. We're going to install Windows 10 64-bit. As you can see, we can install Linux, we can install Mac OS X. I mean, there's a whole bunch of operating system we can install here. And these drop downs don't do anything other than get the virtual machine tweaked so that they run properly for those operating systems. We still need to throw installation media into them so that we can actually install the operating system. So the next piece we'll see is we can select our memory size. You can see we're capped at, obviously, what the physical memory limitation is of this computer, or what VirtualBox thinks our limit is for it. So by default, we're using 2 gig of RAM here. I'm going to double that to 4096. And then the next piece is our hard disk. If we had a virtual hard disk already created that we wanted to reuse in this virtual machine, we could do that now. We don't have that, so we're going to create a new one, and it's going to come up and ask us where we want that to be. We'll say this location is fine, and we can set that size to be whatever we want. Interesting thing is that we can select if we want this to be the fixed size on our physical hard disk, or if we want it to be dynamically allocated. So what this means is that in our virtual machine, we'll see that we have a 50 gig hard drive. But in our physical host, on my Windows that I'm in right now, we'll only see what the usage is of that 50 gig. It won't allocate the entire 50 gig, which is nice because you have that flexibility now to use additional space on your actual host machine and not have to worry about your virtual machine taking it all up when in reality it's not using it. So we'll keep that at dynamically allocated, and we'll leave the hard disk type to be the default. That's fine. We'll hit create, and now we're set up and we're ready to go. Now you'll see we have a whole bunch of other settings here that it didn't ask us about when it set up the virtual machine. So there are a couple of those that we actually want to change. So if we go into settings now, and we're going to first go into storage, and you can see by default there is this virtual optical drive that's there, and we're going to throw our Windows 10 ISO into that. So we're going to choose disk. And the one that I just created is this Windows 10 one. You can see I've done this a few times, but this is the one that we just created with the Windows 10 installation media downloader. So we'll select that and say open. So we're good on the installation media portion. The other thing that we're going to change is the network adapter that we're using. By default, the virtual machine is set up to use NAT, which means that your computer, your virtual machine, is going to have basically its own subnet, which makes it a little bit more difficult for devices outside of the virtual machines to communicate to it. So what I like to do is change this to bridged adapter and select the correct network adapter from the list. In my case, it's going to be my wireless adapter. And what that does is it basically makes it so that your virtual machine is connected to your physical network. It gets another IP address from your physical network through this network adapter that you select. So that does it for everything in here. I guess another thing to note is if we go into system, you can see that base memory that we selected. You can change that at any point when the virtual machine is not running. But but we can also change the number of CPUs that we have access to. So I'm just going to bump up to 2. Might not really be necessary for what we're doing here, but it's nice to have that additional horsepower if it's needed. So we're going to hit OK. And the next thing we'll do is go up here to the start, and I'm going to start up this virtual machine. And if we give it a second or two, it's going to say select the startup disk that you want to use, and we want to use this Windows 10 ISO. And it's going to boot into Windows 10 now. And you can see basically this is as if we had a physical computer, running inside of our computer. So if you've never been through the Windows installation process, we'll walk through that now. It's pretty simple. We're mostly just clicking next. So language and keyboard input, these are all correct by default. We're going to do an install now. I don't have a product key, but if you had one, this is where you would put it in. I'm going to say I don't have a product key. It's going to let me install. It's going to keep a little banner in the bottom right-hand corner that says I need to activate, and I can do that later. We want to use Windows 10 Pro, so we'll select that, and we'll hit Next. We'll accept the EULA. And we want to do a custom install, not an upgrade, because we've never installed before. Where we want to upgrade or install to is this unallocated space. We'll just select it and hit Next. And Windows will go off and start doing its thing. All right, so most of that installation process is now complete, and you can see that the virtual machine is restarting itself. We're not going to press any key to boot from the CD or DVD because we want it to boot into our virtual hard drive now. So now Windows is going to come up and ask us a bunch of questions about different things, and we'll get into Windows. All right, now we've come to some more questions. So yes, we are in the United States. Yes, we have a US keyboard. No, we don't want another one. And you'll note that the mouse seems like it's kind of not so fluid at the moment. This is one of those things that you'll see a massive improvement on after we get into Windows fully and we install those guest edition drivers from VirtualBox. So don't worry if that worries you. All right, the next piece is we're going to choose personal use. And we're going to use an offline account so that we don't have to link this to our Microsoft account. We'll say limited experience, and we're going to put in the username we want to use and the password again. Security questions. I'm just putting in random answers. And we can leave all of these at default. If you're security conscious or privacy conscious, you can turn all these off. It won't affect your usage at all. No, I don't need to worry about that. Don't need to worry about Cortana. And now we are going to finally be into Windows after Microsoft does a few more things. All right, so now we are into Windows. This looks exactly like you'd expect it to look. Next, most important thing to do is we're going to go up here to Devices, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom and do Insert Guest Edition CD Image. And that will basically automatically for us replace that Windows 10 image that was in the our virtual optical drive and replace it with the guest editions. So we'll open up our Windows Explorer now, and we'll go to this PC, and you'll see in the CD-ROM drive, there is this guest editions program, and we're just going to select the straight up VBox Windows Editions application. Say yes, next, next, next. Let it do its thing. It's going to install a bunch of drivers here for networking, for display. And you'll note now, the mouse already, before even booting, the mouse is much more responsive and looks like you'd expect it to look in a version of Windows. So we're going to reboot here just to let it do its thing. And then the very last piece that I would say that is super important just from a stability and security standpoint, especially if you want to keep this virtual machine around for a long time, is to go in and do a Windows update, because there are going to be a lot of updates from that ISO that we created. That's not really the latest and greatest from Microsoft. So we'll go in and do that now. We'll log in. And we'll just click here to the menu and do update. Oops, if I could spell. Check for updates. And check for updates. And that's really it. You're going to come up with updates here that you're going to need to install. Microsoft and Windows will handle that all for you, and you'll restart your machine and you'll be good to go. The other things to note, I guess, for just general controls of the virtual machine is if you go up to this machine drop-down menu, there's a pause, a reset, a shutdown. These are all sort of, the reset and shutdown are sort of your typical power button and restart button on your computer. But the piece that's nice that you get from using a virtual machine is you can just do a pause, which is kind of like a sleep, I guess you could call it, except it really completely shuts down the virtual machine. So right now, if I do a pause, you'll see the screen grays out, and we're no longer using any more hard drive or CPU or networking. Nothing is happening here because the virtual machine is completely paused. So that frees up all of those resources on your host machine. And then if I wanted to get back in, I just come back up, click pause again, and it'll go off to the races again and do what it was doing. So that is the basics of using a virtual machine in Windows. We'll have a bunch more videos on topics like this, particularly moving things up to the cloud and what that looks like if you wanted to run a supervisor in the cloud. So keep subscribed to Brody Precision on YouTube and bptechcenter.com. Thanks.